In 1976, our nation celebrated its 200th birthday. At that time, I was the principal of an elementary school, Pine Creek Elementary School in the West Ottawa School District, and we did walk through our history. If you were ambitious as a community member, citizen, interested in history, on a given Wednesday evening, you could experience a phase of our history. And that's where my costume that I'm wearing today, or the clothing of George Washington's period, came about. I had this made at that time, and since 1976 have offered programs in schools, to community groups, church groups. As we move towards February, we always think of presidents, and of course two of our perhaps greatest presidents, George Washington and Lincoln, celebrate their birthdays during that month of February. As you think in terms of the historic importance of both Washington, our first president, and Lincoln, our 16th president, there are some interesting thoughts to present. Lincoln, during his lifetime, was perhaps not revered, was not necessarily given an important place in history. Yet George Washington received that during his lifetime, his place in history. One of the famous quotes made shortly after his death, attributed to his importance, was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And that's the kind of place that Washington has enjoyed. Even at the closure of his life, he experienced this kind of importance in our country's history. Lincoln, not so. In fact, I have a book here on my library shelf that was printed in 1861. And it's interesting because this was a year after Lincoln had been elected. He was elected in 1860 as president. And it gives a brief biographical sketch in this printed volume of 1861, and it indicates that his place in history is still to be decided. Well, we kind of almost smile at that today because we know the importance of Abraham Lincoln now. But as I said, that didn't come till later, till after his death, when men began to assess, and the history was then written in which it does place him as one of our greatest presidents. George Washington, going back to George for a bit. Now, George Washington was a person that didn't have the intellect of a Thomas Jefferson, didn't have an intellect perhaps of a Franklin, the inventive genius of both of those men, the learned knowledge that they had of languages. None of those truly were probably Washington's attributes. But Washington did have a real genius in terms of a gift for leadership, probably attributed to the fact of his size to some extent. He was a man of 6 feet 3 inches in stature, 220 pounds, and for Washington's day and age, for a colonial person, you certainly towered above the majority of the people of that period, given that size. His friend Lafayette, the famous French nobleman who so aided the American cause in the Revolution, said that he had never seen someone with larger hands, so he was a very imposing person as an individual. Then you take the fact that he was successful at the things, and of course then he was recognized for what he could do, not what he said, but what he actually set out to do. Certainly his devotion, his sense of duty, those are the things that set him apart from many of his countrymen. He had that charisma that's needed sometimes to lead, to be truly a leader. So when it came time for our nation to select its first president, he was the logical choice. He had led us through 8 years of Revolutionary War, through tremendously trying and difficult times. But again, his sense of duty, his loyalty to country, to purpose, those were the things that established him as a key leader. He then was chosen as our first president. And another attribute he had, which I think is really tremendous, he was also very humble, even though he had this charisma, the ability to lead. Very humble because truly he did not want to become president. In fact, there was some thought about the fact that he ought to be called His Royal Highness his sovereignty, something that would be reminiscent of royalty, of which the world at that time was just moving away from to a more Republican form of government. And Washington, in a sense, could have been tempted by this, because to some extent he was a product of his environment, as we all are. And his environment was one in which he had grown up more accustomed to the world having a class society. Mankind moving through either as in the nobility or as a slave or as a servant, and they didn't have the vertical mobility. You were in a class, and that's pretty much the way you went through life. Probably a way to bring that out better than anything else is through one of the British leaders at the time of the American Revolution, Lord North, that made the comment when the discussion was being held in Parliament about the right to representative government, the right to freedom, the things held in our Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Lord North said, I can never acquiesce to the absurd idea that all men are created equal. And this was an honest opinion that he had. And Washington was a product of that time. So it would have been very easy for him to have said, oh, yes, as the first president, I think this is fitting for me to have that type of title. But no, he chose and directed and steered the nation to a position in which they simply addressed him as Mr. President. However, there was the formal side of him. And again, we are a product of our environment. And when you look at the presidency of our first president, he conducted the presidency in a very formal way. Washington was not known to shake hands, not to become that familiar with an audience. He would bow. He would maintain that kind of distance from those that were in his presence. He would receive visitors. He had an established program for receiving visitors when he was in the White House. Or I shouldn't say White House. We think today now the White House hadn't been built, but when he served as president, starting out in New York State. But he was, as I said, very, very formal in terms of if he would invite people to presidential dinners, but he never would return then a visit to the people that called on him and in the White House. So he retained this kind of formalness. As far as the country's respect for him, I think it was Madison who said at the time, or Hamilton, but one of the great leaders of the moment, said when George didn't want to become president, they said, well, George, you know, it's like a barrel. There's 13 states or 13 staves. But a barrel is no good only with staves. It has to have a hoop, something to hold it together. And you're that hoop that can hold these 13 states together. And without you, we aren't going to be successful. And so he did answer his country's call and took on the presidency. And the country gave him a salary of $25,000, which if you compare it by today's standards, that would be a very, very excellent salary. Certainly not proportional to the congressmen of that day. The congressmen, I believe, made $6 a day, and then only on the days that they were in session. And I believe the Speaker of the House, $12 a day for that particular position. Washington then served for 2 terms, and then returned to his beloved Mount Vernon. He lived for several years beyond that. He died just before the turn of the century, so he didn't see the 1800s. He died on December 14 in 1799. One of the things he left in his will, which again shows the character of the man, the foresight of the man, he chose to free his slaves is a part of his will. I think it's always important when we look at our history, and in February seems to be a time in which we spend perhaps a greater effort in looking at our past, maybe because of the tremendous impact that 2 of the leaders born during that time, Washington and Lincoln, had on the formation and the beginning of our country. I think it's important that we realize that this is not really that long ago. And when I talk to school-age groups, I'm always interested in trying to point this out. And I have this plate that was made in 1765. So this was in use 34 years before George Washington died. And I usually send this around to a student audience, and I tell them this is a way to sense history, to actually feel history. And then I suggest that if you check with your grandparents and the older members of our society, that's where history is, that's where it lies. Find out what they know, record what they can tell us. I know I clip articles from newspapers, and not too long ago, I was following the course of a Charlie Smith. And Charlie Smith, every July 4 would celebrate his birthday. And so he was 131 years old, and then 132, and 133. And I kept each 4th of July looking for the paper and to find out if Charlie was still with us. Well, Charlie finally passed away, and 1979, just over 10 years ago, and he was 137 at the time. Well, I think this is significant to point those things out. Most young people, if you were in your high schools or your middle schools even today, they were alive at that time when Charlie Smith, and apparently Charlie Smith was of sound mind. And if you put that back in history, Charlie Smith was born in 1842. Which meant that Charlie Smith, if you went in to talk to him, could have said, oh yeah, I was 18 years old when Lincoln was elected in 1860. And I well remember my mother chatting with me, sharing with me that she had been on as a slave and Washington's plantation, and was there as a very, very small girl, and that she remembers my grandmother then, if you were Charlie Smith, having said that, telling her all about the funeral. So here you could go back within one person's lifetime to their personal recollection through family members of George Washington. So we're a young country with already a fantastic history. And so when we think of February, it certainly is a time to reminisce. It's a time, again, to look back and to reclaim those things that have made us a great nation, and to look at the attributes of a Lincoln and of a George Washington. And through this, history isn't something from the past, but history becomes very much alive and living, and gives us messages for today.
So he took his left hand with a closed fist, which in the sign language is for the letter A, and then he had an open hand on the right hand, which is the sign for the letter L. So that's A-L there to somebody who is able to read sign language. You know, he had a disease of the upper respiratory system. It is known as a Marfari disease. And this is the same disease that his son Tad died of. And he was really failing in health when he started his second term. And the medical experts of today say that he probably would never have finished his second term. I became interested in Abraham Lincoln when I was in the 6th grade. I was given a 7th grade history book, and I saw a picture of Lincoln's first tomb in Springfield. And I said to myself, well, someday I'm going to see that. So as time went on, we finally made arrangements, and one day we went down to Springfield. And that's how I became interested in Abraham Lincoln. Now, in order to give you a little history of Abraham Lincoln, let's start from the grandfather of Abraham Lincoln. He was known as Captain Lincoln, and he was living in Virginia, and he moved to Kentucky. And believe it or not, he had $18,000 when he came to Kentucky. And he bought up a lot of land, and he bought lots in Elizabethtown, and he was continually dealing in the real estate. And his wife's name was Bathsheba. And Lincoln never once during his lifetime, or any time that we can find any document, that he ever mentioned his grandmother. Now, when Captain Lincoln was killed by an Indian, he owned 5,100 acres of land in Springfield and in the counties outside of Illinois. Now, Lincoln's father was Tom Lincoln, and you know some of the historians say that he was lazy and he was always in debt, and that's not true. Abraham Lincoln's father was a juryman, and he was a patroller of the roads, and he was an excellent carpenter. And he also served on the jury, in a jury duty. And more than once, he would buy a little land, but finally he bought 237 acres about 7 miles north of Elizabethtown. And that's where he lived for, maybe about 12 or 13 years. But Mr. Lincoln was brought up to read, and he would spend on his, especially his mother, the maternal mother, Nancy Hanks, and the Sarah Bush Johnson, which was his stepmother, were emphatic upon him to learn to read. Now, when Lincoln was a teenager, there were some guys that would like to pull a trick on him. So one time they said to Mr. Lincoln, would you trade horses unseen? And Lincoln thought a minute and said, yes, I will trade horses unseen, providing I can see your horse first. Oh, well, that was all right. So the day came, and Lincoln went up and looked at the horse, and it was an old steed. Today we'd probably say that the horse was ready for the glue factory. And he petted the horse and stroked his mane and said, not a bad deal, not a bad deal. Well, then they got a little impatient and said, where's your horse, Lincoln? And Lincoln said, just a minute. He went back to the woodshed and he came out with a wooden sawhorse. Then another time, they would have circuit preachers that would come around and preach, and Lincoln could almost imitate word for word what these preachers said. But once in a while, Mr. Lincoln would wonder whether this guy was really on the ball or not. So he would go up to him after the preaching ceremony, and he'd say to the minister, Pastor, I have a little problem in the Bible. And of course the pastor would right away say, oh, what's that, what's that? Well, he said, you know, in the Bible it says James and John were the sons of Zebedee. And he said, no, I just want to know what was the father's name. Who was James and John's father? And some of these men couldn't even tell him what it was. And another thing about Mr. Lincoln is, you know, he married into a rich family in Lexington, Kentucky, and their name was Todd's. Well, when Lincoln married Mary Todd, they would have the relatives from Lexington come down to Springfield, and Mary would entertain her brothers and sisters. And while they were being entertained, once in a while some of these aristocratic fellows would say to Lincoln, how come you wear such odd clothes, or how come you have such ill manners at the table? And Lincoln would take this, but one time he got sick of this, and he said to them when they were talking, he said, you know, there's one thing that bothers me about you Todds. And of course they were all ears, and he said, I would like to know how come that you Todds must have two D's on your end of your name, and God only needs one. And he said they never bothered him again about his manners or his manner of speech and so on. Now, you know, Mr. Lincoln was not a member of the church. And there's one good reason why he wasn't a member of the church, because when he ran for Congress, one of the times he was defeated, and when he was defeated, he found out some way, I don't know just what tactics he used, but there were 23 ministers in Springfield, and Mr. Lincoln wanted to know how these ministers voted. And only 3 out of the 23 voted for him. And Mr. Lincoln couldn't understand how these men were basing their thoughts upon the Bible and still be in favor of slavery. And that is one of the reasons why Mr. Lincoln thought that the church should have feel that people should be equal in church. Now, Lincoln also was a military man to the extent that all the books that were printed on military strategy when he was President of the United States, he read all these books. But he had a group of generals who were graduates from West Point. And one in particular that gave him a lot of trouble was a fellow by the name of General George C. McClellan. McClellan was always down on Mr. Lincoln. And McClellan was head of the Potomac Army, and every once in a while Mr. Lincoln would say that you should move your army, but he'd always have some excuse of some kind. He was either short of horses or he didn't have enough material, didn't have wagons and supplies and so on. So one night Mr. Lincoln and a cabinet member went to the headquarters of McClellan, and when they got to the door, the butler said that the general wasn't in. But he expected him back shortly, and Mr. Lincoln said, well, we'll wait. So they waited, I don't know how long, and finally McClellan came in, but he didn't go where Mr. Lincoln was after the butler told him that Mr. Lincoln was there, and he went upstairs and went to bed. And the butler came down and said, well, the general was real tired, so he went to bed. Well, Lincoln said, okay. But you know, about 6-8 months later, McClellan was relieved of being a general. And Mr. Lincoln never showed any remorse against people who said bad things about him. I don't know if you know this or not, but Mr. Lincoln was called a fool 2 times while he was president. One time when the Confederates were close to Washington, Mr. Lincoln wanted to go out there and see how the armies were. So he went out to a certain point, I think it was Point Stevens, and Mr. Lincoln stood up there and was looking over there, and the doctor who stood about 2 feet from him was hit by a sharpshooter, and a soldier that stood in front of him, about 6 foot, was also hit by a sharpshooter. And Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was in charge of Mr. Lincoln, said, "Get down, you fool." And Mr. Lincoln got down. Now, Mr. Lincoln, of course, being the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, never reprimanded the captain. Just before he left, he said to the captain, "You sure know how to talk to a civilian," and he left it at that. But one time, Mr. Lincoln was talking about certain things, and Secretary of War Stanton heard Mr. Lincoln, and he said, "Did that blank fool say that?" And that cabinet member said, "Yes." So when this cabinet member heard that, he went to Mr. Lincoln and told Mr. Lincoln what Stanton had said. And Lincoln said, "Are you sure that he said that?" And the cabinet member said, "I heard him." "Well," he said, "you know, I must be one." And the cabinet member said, "How come you got that conclusion?" "Well," he said, "you know, Stanton is always right, so I must be one." And he forgot about it. Now, to show Lincoln's compassion for people, shortly oh, just before the end of the war, there were 2 young Confederate soldiers that were captured behind the lines. And of course, they brought him to Stanton, and Stanton immediately wanted them executed. So Mr. Stanton signed the papers that were needed to execute these 2 young men, and he flopped them on Mr. Lincoln's desk. And Lincoln looked at him and said, "Well, I will look at this in the morning." And of course that made Stanton furious, but nevertheless he had to go to the orders of Mr. Lincoln. In the morning, Stanton was very bright and early and wanted Lincoln to sign the execution orders. And Mr. Lincoln said, "I'm not signing them." And Stanton was furious. And then Lincoln said to Stanton, "You know, the Lord has enough widows to take care of, and I'm not going to add to his burden." He said, "Give the horses back to the boys and send them back through the lines." And that's what was done. Now, Gettysburg had a tremendous effect upon Mr. Lincoln. You know, during the war, Mr. Lincoln would go and visit the hospitals around Washington, D.C. about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And after the Battle of Gettysburg, he visited the hospital where the general by the name of Shields was recuperating because he lost a leg at Gettysburg. And the general said to Mr. Lincoln, "Weren't you afraid and panic-stricken before the Battle of Gettysburg?" And Lincoln thought for a moment and said, "No, I really wasn't." "Well, how come?" the general said. "Well," he said, "when I knew that you boys were going to have the battle at Gettysburg, I got into my office, turned the key in the lock, and got down on my hands and knees and prayed to God that we couldn't stand another Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville because the Union forces were soundly defeated at those 2 places." And he said to God, "Now this is your war. It's in your hands. And if you stand by the boys at Gettysburg, I will stand by you." And he said, "I got up from my knees and a calm, serene feeling came over me. And I knew in my heart that you boys would win at Gettysburg." Now, it's also interesting about this Gettysburg address. You know, the battle was fought on July 1, 2, and 3, and Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania came to Gettysburg, and he saw the mess that was there. It is estimated that there were about 6,000 corpses of horses and soldiers lying all over the ground, and Curtin said something had to be done about this. So, okay, they got a committee together, and one of the members of the committee was his name was David Wills, and he was a young lawyer, 32 years old, and he scouted around and he found 17 acres of ground that could be bought for just a little bit less than $2,500, and Curtin told him to go ahead and buy it. And then they got the governors of the other states of the north, and they figured that they would try to get all these soldiers buried in this new plot. Well, now, Will said if this was going to be a national cemetery, we ought to get a good speaker. Well, the best man that was known at that time as to be a real good speaker was a fellow by the name of Edward Everett. And he had been a senator from Massachusetts, he had been governor of Massachusetts, and he had also been ambassador to Great Britain. So they gave him a call, and this was on the latter part of September. And they asked him by telegram whether he would come October 19, when the date was set. But Everett sent a telegram back and said, "I can't be ready for such a momentous occasion by the 19th of October. Could it be that you could postpone it to November 19th? And they said they would have it for November 19. And then the committee decided that whether or not they should really invite the president, since it was a national cemetery. Well, some of the committee weren't in favor of calling Mr. Lincoln because they said he is never serious. He can't say anything serious whatsoever. But Wills insisted that they should invite the president. So on the 2nd of November, they finally sent an invitation to Mr. Lincoln. And Mr. Lincoln accepted. And when he accepted it, he also made arrangements with Stanton for transportation. And Stanton said, well, we'll leave about 6 o'clock in the morning of the 19th. And Lincoln thought for a minute and said, no, we'll go at noon on the 18th and we'll get there in the evening. So that was done. Well, when Mr. Lincoln got there, he was taken to the home of David Wills. And he was very interested in what was happening around Gettysburg. And at that night, Mr. Lincoln made a little speech out of the window at David Wills' home and said that he didn't have anything more to say. And as he was pulling his head in from the window, one of the members of the band said, what's your favorite tune, Mr. Lincoln? He said, how about Dixie? And that was a Southern tune. Well, he finished the Gettysburg address in the evening. The first page of the address, however, was written in ink and White House stationery. So forget about the idea that people say they saw him writing on the train. That was not possible. And he finished the address in pencil. Now, there's one question that is not settled, is he put on the White House stationery under God. Now, they do not know if that was put on when he was in the David Wills home or whether he said it off the cuff when he was giving the speech and then later on put it under God. Now, these copies, I think there are 5 copies of the original Gettysburg Address, and the Illinois State Historical Society about 30 years ago bought one copy and they paid $68,000 for it, and it's in the old Capitol building now under glass. And Mr. Lincoln, when they were ready the next morning, they said the parade would start at 10 o'clock. Well, they couldn't start at 10 o'clock because Edward Everett wasn't there. He was viewing the battlefield. So they waited an hour, and it was at 11 o'clock when the parade finally started toward the cemetery. And of course the main speaker was Edward Everett, and he spoke for 1 hour and 57 minutes. Now, when Wills wrote his invitation to Mr. Lincoln, he said, can you give a short dedicatorial speech? And Lincoln did that. And his speech lasted exactly 1 minute and 57 seconds. And the photographers were stunned that they couldn't take any picture of Mr. Lincoln.